to communicate these ideas in direct conversation, but in writing gave me the freedom to expand and insert more meaning into the words through the plot and the different characters. And I found that that was something that was very satisfying at that time. And I did start writing Nervous Conditions as a student at the University of Zimbabwe in the 1980s, but then it was not published. And so I didn't conceive of myself as a writer. That's when I stopped writing and went to film school in Berlin. And now, because I had actually studied film making, I did conceive of myself as a filmmaker rather than as a writer. But when I finished film school, there were practically no opportunities for a Black woman making films at that time, which was at the end of the last century. And so I could not continue as a filmmaker. And my editor had asked me to then continue writing after Nervous Conditions was published. And so I went back to writing. I don't conceive of myself as a writer because I don't write easily. I think part of the reason is that there is not a writing community in Zimbabwe that I am part of. We find in Zimbabwe that there is very little activity that really stems from the citizens, because citizens don't really have the resources. So you have to be aligned with the government or to be aligned with some international entity in Zimbabwe to be able to form a community and make things happen. And it is very complicated for someone who is not aligned in that way to be a member of a community. And so there are various forces that work to make me feel that I write, but I am not actually a writer.
Oh, that is an interesting distinction. I would note that I'm sure many people are aware that you were arrested not all that long ago. Could you speak some about why you were arrested and where things are with that?
Yes, Jeff, I was arrested on the 31st of July in Harare here in Zimbabwe. And I was arrested because I was standing on a street corner with two placards. One of them read, "We want better institutions, reform our institutions," or words to that effect. And the other one read, "Free Hopewell, free Jacob." Hopewell is a journalist in Zimbabwe who has been uncovering a lot of alleged fraud and corruption in the government, including the First Family. And he has since been arrested twice for that. So my arrest came when I was protesting his first arrest. Jacob is a politician in a small opposition party. And as the president of that party, he had called for a demonstration against corruption. And because he had called for this demonstration, he was also arrested. So I was demonstrating in solidarity with them, and also in solidarity with the general cause that the people of Zimbabwe should make their displeasure known, displeasure with respect to the state of the economy and the reasons for the state of the economy: misgovernance, corruption, incompetence, lack of rule of law, and so forth. I felt it was my duty as a citizen to ask that our institutions, such as the judiciary, the police, the armed forces, and so forth, be reformed. And I thought it was my duty as a citizen to request a better, dignified life for citizens in this country. Now, a few days before the demonstration, the government had declared it illegal. And most people had decided that they would not demonstrate because the stakes are high. However, I had been very vociferous on social media in encouraging people to participate in the demonstration. And I felt that I needed to have the courage of my convictions. Fortunately, a friend of mine accompanied me because it can be very dangerous to demonstrate on your own. If you demonstrate on your own and there are no witnesses, one can simply disappear, maybe to appear again and sometimes not to appear again. This is known to happen in the country.
Wow.
Although more recently, people have generally reappeared after being disappeared. So I was with a friend at this street corner, and a riot vehicle with about 20 armed riot policemen in it came down and stopped, and we were asked to get into the vehicle, and that's how we were arrested.
Wow. How long were you in jail?
I was in jail for one night. When we appeared before the court, it seemed that we would not be given bail. And then at some point, mercifully, for whatever good reasons that this happened, for which I'm very grateful, we were given bail on that day. Most of the people, many of the people who were arrested in connection with that event had to apply for bail from jail and had their bail hearings stretched out, and some of them had to appeal to the High Court to get their bail. But we were in jail for only one night. They made sure that we went to court the next day and we were given bail that day.
I see. I think this is a fascinating phenomenon. Maybe fascinating is not the right word, but it's just a way of saying that so many writers, so many of us writers in the West never faced this kind of scrutiny or injustice. We never go to jail. I remember years ago that Penn published an anthology that was titled something like, and do they really shoot writers? But writing obviously means something, it means something important in the country that you come from.
Yes, yes, Jeff. I did not expect to be arrested on that day. I knew that we had a repressive regime in Zimbabwe, but I did not think it was as repressive as people said. There had been a lot of talk on social media about how to protest in a way that is in alignment with the constitution, because the Zimbabwean constitution does give Zimbabwean citizens the right to petition and demonstrate peacefully. So the emphasis was on small groups, on positive messages, and on remaining peaceful, no chanting, no singing, no dancing, or anything of that nature. And my friend and I had adhered to this, and I had not expected to be arrested for standing peacefully by the roadside, doing something that I am constitutionally permitted to do. The charges do not have to do with demonstrations, because there are no laws that outlaw demonstrations as such. However, we do have laws that outlaw gatherings of more than a certain number of people. And in the current version of the law, it is more than one person. And we also have COVID regulations which restrict movement. And so I have been charged with intention to incite violence, attending a gathering with intention to incite violence and breach of the peace, as well as with defying the COVID regulations. And it just shows that actually it shows that there is an attempt by the government to restrict citizens' freedoms even more than has been the case in the past, and to use the law as a weapon to intimidate citizens. And I was shocked that, in fact, the government is as repressive as people say in this respect. And I was disappointed to find that it was true.
Okay, I see. I think there was a lot of hope in Zimbabwe that things might change after Mugabe's death, or am I wrong in stating such?
Yes, there was a lot of hope in Zimbabwe in a post-Mugabe era. It was not so much the hope in the late Mr. Mugabe's death as in the fact that he was deposed by the military in 2017. So people did hope that the coup would usher in an era of greater democracy and more freedom. I think that this hope was misplaced because the people who prosecuted the coup actually told the population that the coup was in order to save ZANU-PF as a party. And the nation, the nation was not mentioned. And so I think we were not paying attention. And so for me, the results are not surprising. And I was one person who had not thought it was a good idea that a transition should be achieved through the military.
I see. So for those who don't know, ZANU-PF is the party that rules the country. So I think I would just mention that. I know in a previous conversation you told me once that you actually supported Mugabe at a certain point in your life. Could you speak to that maybe?
Yes, at independence, everybody, well, I'll take that again. At independence, most Zimbabweans, and especially most Shona-speaking Zimbabweans, were very supportive of ZANU-PF. Excuse me, I have to take that whole thing again. At independence, most Zimbabweans, at least most Shona-speaking Zimbabweans, were very supportive of ZANU-PF. It was actually a pattern that we saw repeated at the time of the coup, in that we had this formation calling itself ZANU-PF, saying it was fighting on behalf of the people, coming into power on that ticket, and then showing itself not to be coming into power on behalf of the people, but on behalf of itself. And so it took time for most people to realize that we were not really under a government that had people as its main concern, but a government that had its own elite status as its main concern. And so many people, myself included, realized that the hopes of democracy and Zimbabwe in which citizens were democratically free to prosper even was not something that ZANU-PF was primarily interested in delivering. That took time, and it was a process.
Yes. Well, I guess certainly they were involved in the actual war. I was surprised to discover that Mugabe himself was not a soldier. He was a school teacher, if I'm not wrong. And I think he spent a good part of the war in Mozambique, hanging out at luxury resorts, in fact. So.
Yes. Zimbabweans at that time had a lot of respect for education. And so people with education who were in the struggle tended to be in higher positions. I really don't know that much about the war because we don't really have a lot of history that is easily accessible publicly. The general narrative is the one of the victorious soldiers, the armies that laid down their lives for the people and for freedom. And the head of the party, Mr. Mugabe, was the figurehead that narrative was built around. We definitely have a system of worshipping personalities in Zimbabwe. And so he became the worshipped personality. I think now that this was something that was engineered by all the people who were involved in the liberation war effort, which would be, of course, the nationalist army itself, but also their allies, which at that time, those that were strategic allies were in the east of this world. I wouldn't really want to cast aspersions on a party that picked a particular figure to be its head. And I also think that it might have been a good thing that we had somebody who was essentially a civilian as the first head of state in Zimbabwe. I can see advantages to that rather than having had a military man come in as the leader of the country.
Yes, I understand. What do you think it will take to bring about change in Zimbabwe? Which is also, I suppose, a way of asking, what can the international community do, if anything?
Bringing about new change in Zimbabwe now is a very tall order. We have a very exhausted, impoverished, and immiserated population. It's a population where basic human needs are hardly met for the majority of the population. Dignified work that pays enough for a person to live a dignified life is almost non-existent. 80%, if not more, unemployment. Businesses are closing by the day. Production is emigrating from the country to neighboring countries, and this is a trend that's been going on for years now. The health system has collapsed. The education system is also collapsing. Service delivery is non-existent. People in the cities now go and queue for water at boreholes and are lucky if they get potable water, because so much of it is contaminated because there has been no attempt to maintain the sewage and sewerage systems.
Wow.
So the roads are another problem. Some of the main roads have been redone, but most of the roads are in a terrible situation. The rural areas have just been left to become even more destitute. The idea that Zimbabwe will be middle class, the idea that Zimbabwe will be a middle income nation by 2030 is one of the tickets that Mr. Mnangagwa's government came into. I'll take that again. The idea that Zimbabwe will be a middle income nation by 2030 was one of the promises that Mr. Mnangagwa's government made to the people, but it seems to be receding further and further. This year alone, we have potentially 60 to 70% of the population in danger of starvation and in need of food aid. Now, in this scenario, the way the international community has engaged so far has been on the humanitarian front, to come in with medicines and food, that kind of thing. And this is very necessary. But it is not really the humanitarian basics like food and water that really build a nation. A nation is built on ideas, and propagating ideas is something that requires money. People who can generate ideas have to have the creative freedom and the environment and resources to generate these ideas and propagate them. And that is almost impossible to do in Zimbabwe. So I think that if we really want to see a change in Zimbabwe and in other countries like Zimbabwe, there has to be some engagement with making it possible for creative people of ideas in very many areas to produce their ideas and to disseminate them into the population. This would, of course, include the creative industries, but we do know that the creative industries are often the least to be supported. And certainly in Zimbabwe, when the international community engages at that level of creative ideas, they engage within the areas of human rights and government and democracy, which is very important, but they do not engage with the ideas that relate to the nation's aspirations and interrogation of who the nation is and what the nation is. And without that process, there can be no change. It's absolutely the same with a human being. A human being who falls into crisis has to introspect and has to go through that whole process of representing her or his own life to her or his own self in order to analyze it. So unless we get investment in that process on the continent, my thinking is that nothing will change.
Oh, I see. I would say that I've been to Zimbabwe several times, and one of the things that's, well, there were really two things that struck me. One is the suffering of the people, and part of that suffering is just reflected how expensive everything is and how many shortages there are for water and other kinds of things. But really, I think it's the most expensive country I've been in terms of just like buying food, from the supermarket and such. And I was also struck by how beautiful the country it is. I don't know why I was struck by it, but these are things you don't hear about. But really, Zimbabwe is such a beautiful country.
Yes, Jeff, Zimbabwe is shockingly expensive at the moment. I find that my standard of living is decreasing, and I am still a person who is in a much better situation. My children have all left home, and so my husband and I decided that we don't have to eat meat so much. I'm actually vegetarian. So we decided that he doesn't have to eat meat every day, for example. I might go to the doctor and I might be asked to go for a test, and I won't go because even though I have medical insurance, the shortfalls are horrendous. One visit to a specialist for a test might take a third of my salary.
Wow.
And yeah, and that's for somebody at my level, which is a better level.
Yes.
And so it is really very difficult to think of how the ordinary Zimbabwean is surviving. And then this has implications for how people are going to think and how that thinking is going to shape their behavior. Everybody is going to be living on edge in such a situation. Everybody thinks only of how do I ensure that I get through this day? And that doesn't foster long-term planning and engagement with ideas about how the situation can be changed so that we don't need to live like that. And I really think that people who have the capacity still to engage at that level need to find some way of accessing the resources that they need to continue with that imaginative work. But it is a heartbreaking country. People who can shop outside, they go to Bulawayo, and then from Bulawayo, they go to either South Africa or Botswana. And in fact, there are many businesses in South Africa that will send up even ordinary groceries. So the effect of that is to drive up the prices in Zimbabwe more. So it really is a terribly vicious cycle that we're in, and we need to find a way to stop it. It is a beautiful country. It is one of the most beautiful countries I've seen as well. But even there, we have interventions that are threatening that. I've seen that there is not a great deal of respect for our old buildings from the colonial time, and they're being pulled down and concrete structures are being put up. At the same time, the government is pushing Zimbabwe as a tourist destination, but nobody's going to want to come to this country to see concrete sheds and wholesalers. Right. Then there is the issue of land degradation. Wildlife is, again, one of the tourist attractions that we have, but we hear that there is prospecting in the game reserves now. So even the game reserves are being turned into potential mine sites. And the government is also encouraging what they call artisanal mining, which is really subsistence level mining, which is hardly controlled. Of course, there are nominal controls, but you cannot actually stop somebody near a river or an old mine from just getting up and starting digging. And this is degrading the landscape. So we are beginning to see in the physical beauty of the country that the lack of order is impacting and destroying even that physical beauty.
That's very unfortunate. Yes. So I do know that you believe that that you were developed to have raised to have social conscience and also believed to give back to the community, and that you've mentioned a number of times about engaging with people during our talk today. And I wonder if those are all ideas that that figure into your work as an artist. Or maybe I could phrase the question differently. You know, you and I met in Bellagio, and I have to say that one of the things that surprised me was that you were still living in Zimbabwe. Because I always assumed that you would be, you know, faced with arrest, and I assumed that there would be other kinds of issues of censorship that you might be subject to as well. But I also got the sense that one of the reasons that you have remained in Zimbabwe is because you want to engage with the people, and that you want to give back to the community and to develop young artists there. So I just thought I would ask you about your reasons for remaining in Zimbabwe and what you hope to do as an artist in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, Jeff, I did begin my conscious life that I remember in England. And while I was very fortunate to have a good foster home, it was not the most happy of situations. I remember incidents that really puzzled me when I was a child, 3, 4, 5. And now looking back, I see that they were incidents of racism.
Yes.
And just the fact of being separated from your family at that age, it is a traumatizing experience that I think I did not recover from. And then living away from my parents and only coming back to my parents when we returned to Zimbabwe was also quite traumatizing, because by that time, I had accepted that the English family I lived with was my family. And then it suddenly turned out that it wasn't, and that strangers were my family, and a strange place was my home. And I did suffer a lot of trauma as a very small child. And this was pre-verbal trauma, because I said that I developed language at the time when I was in England. And so it took a lot of time to resolve. And so it would have been normal for me to go back to England, as many people from former British colonies did. And in fact, I did. But I had to confront some of these issues. I went to Cambridge, to Sydney Sussex College. And in fact, there were very positive times at the college, but most of the Zimbabweans I knew were in London, and I would visit them there and spend time with them, especially over the summer. And there, the contradictions were just right in my face again. And that was the time that Zimbabwe became independent. And so it seemed to me that having a good time in Cambridge was not really going to answer the questions that I still had, and that it would be better to be in Zimbabwe. And I really did that for me, because I still had not managed to bring all these different aspects of my experience together. And then being in Zimbabwe, I could see and participate in the euphoria of independence, but I felt that people were not looking beyond that moment of euphoria. And that's where I felt that maybe some of the things that I had thought about and experienced in England as an older person in these different environments that I was in Cambridge and in London, would be useful. So it just seemed to me to be the right thing to stay in Zimbabwe at the time. Then after I finished and graduated, I had wanted to study clinical psychology, and I had been told that that course would be available, but it wasn't. And so I was at a loose end. I hadn't applied to go anywhere because I had been told the course was opening. And that's when I got into filmmaking. Okay. Because I couldn't decide what to do, and the opportunity came up. And I thought to myself, well, it was another area of communication and storytelling. So I felt that that might work for me. And from there, I went to film school. Film school was in Germany, where at the time it was very difficult for a non-German Black person to achieve anything. And I also had 2 children while I was in Germany. And looking at the way the society was constructed there, it really was clear to me that my children would be better off growing up in Zimbabwe. So I came back.
Okay, I see. You've said in a previous conversation that you're not a student of literature. What do you mean by that exactly?
I mean that I only studied literature up to Form 4. I did O-level English, and then any reading that I did after that was purely for pleasure. And so I've never really studied literature at an advanced level. My writing is therefore not so constrained by form, accepted forms and accepted ways of doing things, which is a liberation in one way, but it does make me second guess myself all the time. Am I doing this right? Is it really working? And I think that although I'm not a formal student of literature, I have tried to keep up with my reading, and I do keep up with reading whenever I can. And of course, the African-American women writers featured very much in pointing a path for me. And I read in one of Toni Morrison's interviews that she said she writes her work and then she would go back to make it appear unwritten. And that seemed to really resonate with me. And that gave me the courage to work even in ways that are not maybe formally correct as far as the tradition of writing is concerned.
Okay, I see. So this question of being formally correct or incorrect, as it were, may have something to do with engaging with the particular audiences that you want to engage with.
Sorry, engaging with?
Oh, sorry. I was asking if I guess what I was trying to ask is if one of your primary purposes in writing is this question of engagement. I guess what I'm really trying to ask is if you have any feelings about writers who write above the heads of their readers, so to speak.
Who write a book so that?
Who write above the heads of their readers, so to speak. Yes.
Okay. I'm not really sure whether it's possible to write above the heads of your readers, because you obviously have readers who want to read that. And so I would say you are not writing above the heads of those kinds of readers.
Okay.
So for me, it really is a question of who do you want to engage with? And I have definitely wanted to engage with a wide African audience, beginning with a wide Zimbabwean audience. And that was very important to me.
Okay.
I may develop other literary aims as I go along, but up until now, that has been my aim. And I have had to be very careful to find ways of doing it. And it's not just in the language, it is also in the form of the book. You know, this hero's journey is not something that resonates at the level of experience with most people in a situation like the situation that Zimbabweans are in, because you can't do that. You can't stand up one day and say, I want to do this, and then try your best to do it and expect to be successful at the end of it. People's life stories are not like that. And so I have had to find ways of having a subjective trajectory, which is not really premised on the hero's journey. And yeah, it's been quite interesting.
That is interesting way of putting it. Well, in order to engage with the audience that you want to engage with, is that one reason you've decided to write in English as opposed to say to Shona?
Yes, my Shona really is not of a standard to write well in. I did not even study it up to O level. In fact, I never had a public exam in Shona at all. And so it just wouldn't work. There are other issues with the Shona language. We do not have a government that has really taken the development of the language seriously. And so a lot of the concepts that are everyday concepts in modern life are not represented in Shona. And I find that is really a constraint on the language, and also a constraint in developing imagination in the language. There are people who are proficient at it, but I do feel that this lack by government has not improved the status of Shona literature. And so I just feel that I am more at home when I have the concepts readily available to me in English. So that's the language I use.
Okay, yes. I would say it seems to me that there have been some interesting successes with writers from Zimbabwe in recent years. I'm thinking of the young woman who wrote House of Stone, for example, or Novolo, how do you say her name?
Novio Chuma.
Novio Chuma, yes, and Novio Violet as well. Not to mention your short list for the Booker Prize. That was a important thing, and I think many of us were rooting for you, certainly. So there has been this kind of emergence of writing from Zimbabwe, but I wanted to go back and just ask you about the origins of writing um, in Zimbabwe, which is, I think, as many people know, that you were the first woman writer from Zimbabwe to write first Black woman writer from Zimbabwe to write a novel in English. But you were there along with some other young writers who were very important, and I'm thinking in particular of one, Dem Budzul Machera, and I wonder if you could speak about him. I know that Patina Gapa has recently written a play about him, I believe. Um,
Yeah, Nambudzo Marechera is one of the key figures in Zimbabwean literature because he was such a colorful personality, as well as having a very strong and explosive, impactful style of writing. And we had come out of a history where writing by Black people in Zimbabwe, which was Rhodesia at the time, was administered by the Literature Bureau. And the Literature Bureau was a government department. And the purpose of the Literature Bureau was to make sure that writing was in English, and also to keep control of the themes that people wrote about. So the Literature Bureau supported writing that had to do with the rituals of the past and the magic and involvement with witchcraft that was still going on, and basically migrations from the country to the city, the kinds of things that fitted into the colonial purpose. And so somebody like Nambudzo Marechera started writing when this kind of Literature Bureau narrative was all that Zimbabweans had been exposed to. And it was completely new. Yes. Here was somebody who engaged with his own subjectivity and demanded to take center place as a formed subject in his narrative. And it just wasn't something that anybody had thought of doing to that extent, in the way that he did it, in that he was in conversation with himself and his environment at the time. Of course, there were other writers who were writing, like Stanley Nyamfokudza, Wilson Katio, and Charles Mungoshi, to name some of them, but not so much in that way that claimed space for the self and said, I am as much a subject in this world as anybody else is. And I think that is what really appealed to young male Black Zimbabweans in particular.
Okay. He was doing a lot of experimentation with form, certainly. I'm very fascinated by his work. Recently, there was a book published by another young writer who died young. I believe his name is pronounced Philip Zuwayo. Are you aware of this book? Or?
No, I'm not aware of this book. Which book is it? Do you remember the title?
I think it's called Sunrise Poison, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, probably taken from.
Yeah, he was. He passed away before he published any books, but apparently they're in the process of publishing 4 of his books that were unpublished at the time that he died. He was only 27 when he passed away in the early 90s. So
I see. No, I hadn't heard of him at all. So
yeah.
I will look out for him.
Yes. So that's yes. So you were saying before that your family immigrated to England when you were young, that you were only 2 years old, and that you lost the ability to speak Tishona for a time. And I wonder if how that has affected your work at all, if anything. And I don't know what I'm asking exactly, but I guess I'm sort of asking your questions, your feelings about this question that Ngugi wa Thiong'o has argued that African writers should write in the original languages first, and then those things can be translated into English. Do you have any particular feelings about that question?
As far as language captures a universe and a particular perspective on a universe and subjectivity, then I think it is fair to want to encourage writers whose first language is not, let's say, a colonial language, a former colonial language, to write in their first languages, because I do think that this gives us a glimpse into a different sensitivity, a different way in which the world is perceived. But I don't think that one should be dogmatic about it. I would never say you should, just as I would not say you should write in English or Portuguese or any other language that was introduced by European colonizers. For me, I did at some point early in my life feel that I lacked something in not having a writing capacity in Shishona, but that has passed away because definitely I want to communicate, which English does very well. And as I said before, I feel that the language is limited by not being brought forward to accommodate the concepts of modern living. For example, it would be impossible to teach a chemistry class at a university in Shishona because we just don't have the concepts. They haven't been developed. It's not that they don't exist, but because people were not conducting complex chemistry experiments in Shishona before the influence of the colonial regimes, the language has not been developed to accommodate it. And I feel that this is a great lack. I think that the fact that we did not do this means that there is a part of our creativity and that the power of our imagination that we are not tapping into. And I try to do this through using language that does not really conform to standard English. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I wrote a short film, which was subsequently produced, but when the potential funders wrote back to me to say they were interested, they said, but you should find somebody who writes English well because your dialogues are not in good English.
Oh, wow. That's something.
Exactly. And that was the whole point of not having them in good English, that I could evoke that sense of being Shona. And I find that it's something that I have developed a skill at, and it's something I enjoy. And it enables people who are not originally speakers of Shishona to engage as well. And even in Zimbabwe, we have 11 other official languages. So I do not find it a handicap, and I would certainly not prescribe which language any writer should write in.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about your early interest in the arts and when you knew that you were an artist.
You know, I have said that I had been interested in the arts for a long time. And in fact, I cannot say that I knew that I was an artist, but I knew that I had an interest in the arts. And actually, this goes back to that time when I was a child, very young child in England, because being young people of color in a white environment, small town, I did not have many friends. And so I would spend most of my time watching TV. And I can remember being entranced by ballerinas, and it seemed to lift me out of my body. I had a difficult relationship with my body anyway, because the whole process of separating from the mother is very formative in a child's development. And I had been separated from my mother at a time when I was still completing that process. And so watching these ballerinas floating around the stage gave me the feeling of connection with my body. And I think it was at that moment that I realized that there was an experience in life that could be restorative. It was a working class family, because obviously it would be a working class family that did fostering. And so there were no books in the house. So that was the only thing that I got to see that could be described as art. And I had a very strong reaction to it. And then later on, when I started reading books, when we were back in Zimbabwe around the age of 6, I had that same experience. And then when I started music, I had the same experience. And so I had this idea from a very early age that art is transformational. And I knew that when I looked at the society, I knew that the society needed transformation. And therefore, it was very clear to me that one could use art for that transformation.
That's very powerful. So it seems to me that that your having studied psychology has had an impact on you as an artist and as a transformational artist, one who's interested in transformation. Could you speak to that a
Yes,
bit? Yes.
definitely studying psychology had an impact on me as an artist. What studying psychology did for me was to validate my hunch that people can transform and can actually need to transform, and that this is not something that I had just thought about, but it is something that has occupied science for a long time, that it really validated my idea that behavior can change. And that means all the internal antecedents of behavior can change as well. And that was really important validation for me. I don't know whether I would have been able to write if I had not had that validation. And I wasn't getting it from the society that I lived in. And so it was very important for me to get it from studying psychology.
Wow. Would you say it's true that I know a young African writer who feels that that sometimes scholars don't give the same psychological attention to African novels and African characters as they do to, let's say, Western novels and Western characters. Do you feel that's a valid criticism?
I do think there is something in that, because there is an African in the Western imagination. And this African in the Western imagination stems from the way Europeans coming to Africa half a millennium and more ago reacted to the people they saw. And these people were not seen as fully human. They certainly were not seen as equal, with senses and sensitivities and subjectivities that were in nature, if not in content, the same as the people that they encountered. And this imagination informs much of the way the West interacts with Africa up until today. This can be seen, for example, in the whole industry of development aid. It is focused on simply keeping bodies alive, but it is not focused on improving the quality of life of these bodies. And so if one is coming from that kind of imagination, it will be very difficult to conceive that the product of these African minds is as complex and as deserving of complex analysis as is the product of what I would call a white or European, Anglo-Saxon, Judeo-Christian mind.
Yes, yes, yeah. That says a lot. Well, I think I have just one final question, which is I'll ask you about what you're working on now.
At the moment, I'm working on a young adult fiction. It's dystopian. It's set in post-apocalypse Africa. And I started writing it when I saw my son nearly a decade ago reading Percy Jackson. And I thought, oh, it's great to read Percy Jackson based on Greek and Roman mythology, but couldn't there be something that looked at a cosmology that had an African subjectivity to it? So alongside the time that I was writing This Mournable Body, I was also writing that novel.
Oh, okay. So I think it would be fair to describe you as a slow writer. If that was a decade ago. And I remember when we were at Bellagio together in 2016, you were working on that same project. And
Yeah, because there's no money in writing here. Bellagio was like the second fellowship that I'd ever had for writing. The other one had been 3 weeks in 3 weeks in Italy in '97
wow.
at Civitella. So that Rockefeller one was the second one that I had. I worked as founder and director of an NGO which had a women's film festival. And so that is actually what I did to earn a living, because I've never been in a situation where I can write.
Yeah.
And so the demands of just earning a living, with my books not doing well at the time, they were not doing well. It just meant that I didn't have the time to write. And then I had the 3 children, and then the situation was as it is in Zimbabwe. And so really, there were times when I wouldn't be able to write for like months on end. And it was just a feat. And I'm really grateful and quite impressed with myself that I managed to continue and just not give up completely.
Yes, yes.
I'm hoping that maybe I'll get some kind of fellowship. The one that I really would love to get is the Iowa Writers Workshop, but it was offered to me when Nervous Conditions came out, but I had already been accepted in Germany, and so I went to learn filmmaking. And of course, I've been writing scripts. I have about 6 scripts that are written, but I haven't been able to fund. So it's the novel writing that was constrained. Writing scripts had a potentially better prospect for earning a living, because if you get production funds, then you can also live on the production funds, and that's not the same. I've had my first reasonable advance for writing only recently. Most of the other times, I remember with the Women's Press, I got £850 for Nervous Conditions. That was my advance.
Wow.
With Ayebia Clark, I got no advance whatsoever.
Wow.
So it really was almost impossible for me to continue writing, and I'm just glad that I managed to, however slowly.
Well, I'm sure that the world recognizes the importance of both your films and your writing, and that you will have many more rewarding grants and fellowships and advances come your way. So thank you, Tsitsi, for making time today.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for the platform.
Yes. Okay. Thanks.